Turn on a faucet right now. Watch the water flow. Feel how easy it is, how reliable, how completely we take it for granted. Now imagine that faucet going dry, not for a day or a week, but for years, for generations. Imagine watching everything you've built slowly turn to dust. Here is something that should unsettle you. Around 4,200 years ago, a drought struck the ancient world that was so severe, so prolonged, that it brought down the first great civilizations humanity had ever built. Empires that had stood for centuries collapsed within decades, and we're still not entirely sure why. The Akkadian Empire, the world's first true empire, vanished Old Kingdom Egypt. The civilization that built the pyramids fell into chaos. The Indus Valley civilization, one of the most sophisticated urban cultures of the ancient world, abandoned its great cities. All around the same time, it seems, because the rains stopped falling. If you are settling in for sleep tonight, this is the kind of mystery that puts our modern worries in perspective. Climate has always shaped human destiny. The civilizations we build are only as stable as the water that sustains them. Subscribe and stick around. To understand what happened, you need to understand what the world looked like before the drought. Around 2300 BCE, humanity had achieved something remarkable. For the first time in history, large-scale civilizations with cities, writing, and complex governments had emerged in multiple regions. In Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Sargon of Akkad had united the warring city-states into the world's first empire. His realm stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Millions of people lived under a single government, speaking a common language, trading across vast distances. In Egypt, the Old Kingdom had reached its zenith. The pyramids at Giza had been built just a few centuries earlier, monuments to a civilization of unprecedented wealth and organization. The Nile flooded reliably each year, bringing water and fertile silt to the fields. Life was good. In the Indus Valley, the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro housed tens of thousands of people. They had sophisticated urban planning, indoor plumbing, standardized weights and measures. Their trade networks reached Mesopotamia. They had achieved something remarkable and seemingly permanent. And in China, the Longshan culture was building the foundations for what would become Chinese civilization. Across the ancient world, humanity was thriving as never before. The future seemed bright. Then, something changed. Starting around 2200 BCE, the climate shifted, monsoons weakened, rivers shrank. Rains that had fallen reliably for centuries became erratic. Then rare, a drought settled over the ancient world that would last for decades, perhaps centuries. Scientists call this the 4.2 kiloyear event. The catastrophe that occurred 4,200 years before present. It is now recognized as one of the most significant climate events in human history, a turning point that reshaped civilizations across multiple continents. The evidence comes from multiple sources. Ice cores from Kilimanjaro show a sudden drop in precipitation. Sediment cores from the Gulf of Oman reveal windblown dust, evidence of drought and desertification. Tree rings, cave formations, lake sediments, all tell the same story of a world growing drier. In the Mediterranean region, pollen records show forests giving way to scrubland. In the Near East, agricultural settlements were abandoned as farming became impossible. The fertile lands that had nurtured civilization were turning to desert. Let me take you through what happened to each of these great civilizations, because the story of how they fell reveals something important about the fragility of human achievement and the power of climate to shape our destiny. The Akkadian Empire was the first to fall. Sargon's grandson Naram Sin had expanded the empire to its greatest extent. He called himself King of the Four Quarters of the world. Cuneiform tablets describe a realm of unprecedented power and prosperity. But then the records change. Tablets begin describing failed harvests, rising grain prices, people fleeing the cities, nomadic peoples pressing against the empire's borders, driven from their own lands by the same drought that was destroying Akkadian agriculture. Within a few decades of Naram Sin's death, the Akkadian Empire had collapsed. Its capital city was abandoned. Regional governors broke away to form independent kingdoms. The great unification Sargon had achieved dissolved into chaos and war. Archaeological evidence from the Akkadian heartland tells the story in physical terms. Settlements that had thrived for centuries show sudden abandonment. Agricultural fields were buried under windblown sand. The infrastructure that had supported millions simply stopped functioning. A text called The Curse of Akkad describes the collapse in apocalyptic terms. For the first time since cities were built and founded, the great agricultural tracts produced no grain, the inundated tracts produced no fish, the irrigated orchards produced neither syrup nor wine. The gathered clouds did not rain. The text continues. The fields lacked water. This wasn't metaphor or exaggeration, it was description. The climate had changed, and with it, everything else. In Egypt, the collapse was equally dramatic, but took a different form. The Old Kingdom had been stable for over 4 centuries. 6 dynasties of pharaohs had ruled from Memphis, building pyramids, temples, and an elaborate bureaucracy. Egypt's stability depended entirely on the Nile. Each year, the river flooded, depositing rich silt across the agricultural lands. Egyptian farmers didn't need rain. They had the Nile. As long as the flood came, Egypt prospered. But the Nile's floods depended on monsoon rains far to the south. In the Ethiopian highlands, when the monsoons weakened during the 4.2 kiloyear event, so did the Nile floods. And when the floods failed, Egypt starved. Inscriptions from the late Old Kingdom describe horrors. All of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger. One text reads, "People were eating their children." Whether literally true or not, such descriptions convey the severity of the crisis. The central government lost control. Provincial governors, called nomarch, stopped sending tribute to Memphis. They hoarded what resources remained for their own populations. Egypt fractured into competing territories, each struggling to survive. This period is called the First Intermediate Period, a euphemism for over a century of chaos, civil war, and suffering. The Great Pyramid, building civilization, had collapsed. It would take generations to rebuild anything like the old unity and prosperity. The Indus Valley civilization presents an even more dramatic case. At its height, it covered an area larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Its cities showed remarkable sophistication, grid-pattern streets, sophisticated drainage, standardized brick sizes across the entire civilization, and then it vanished. The great cities were abandoned. The population dispersed into smaller settlements. The writing system, which we still cannot read, stopped being used. Within a few centuries of the 4.2 kiloyear event, the Indus Valley civilization had effectively ceased to exist. Archaeological evidence shows the decline was gradual but inexorable. The later levels of Mohenjo-Daro show declining standards. Houses built with reused bricks, drains no longer maintained, public buildings converted to other uses. A civilization slowly giving up. What happened? The most likely explanation is that the rivers the civilization depended on, the Indus and its tributaries, especially the now dry Gaga, Hakra, changed their courses or shrank dramatically. Without reliable water, the cities couldn't be sustained. Recent research suggests the monsoons that fed these rivers weakened significantly during the 4.2 kiloyear event. The same climate shift that dried the Tigris and weakened the Nile also reduced the water supply to the Indus Valley. A connected catastrophe across the ancient world. Let me tell you more about what made these civilizations vulnerable, because understanding their specific weaknesses helps us see the patterns that lead to collapse. The Akkadian Empire was built on irrigation agriculture. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers isn't naturally fertile. It is naturally dry. Civilization there depended on an elaborate system of canals, dikes, and reservoirs that channeled river water to the fields. This irrigation system was a marvel of ancient engineering. It required constant maintenance, coordinated labor, and centralized management. When the government weakened, maintenance suffered. When maintenance suffered, the system degraded. When the system degraded, food production fell, and irrigation in that region had a fatal flaw. The water that brought life also brought salt. As water evaporated from the fields, it left mineral deposits behind. Over centuries, the soil became increasingly saline, less and less able to support crops. The Akkadians were already farming soil that had been irrigated for over 1,000 years. The salt buildup was becoming a problem even before the drought. When reduced water meant less flushing of the soil, the salinization accelerated. The land was dying even as the rains failed. Egyptian agriculture was different. The Nile flood naturally flushed salts from the soil and deposited fresh silt each year. This made Egyptian farming more sustainable in the long term, but it also made Egypt utterly dependent on that annual flood. When the flood failed, there was no backup. The Indus Valley civilization had yet another pattern. They depended on multiple rivers, fed by both monsoon rains and Himalayan snowmelt. This seemed like diversification, multiple water sources rather than one. But when the monsoons weakened, all the sources shrank together. All three civilizations shared something crucial. They had grown to depend on conditions that seemed permanent, but weren't. Their populations had expanded to match their food production. When production fell, there were too many people and too little food. This is a pattern we see again and again in human history. Societies expand to fill the resources available to them. They build systems optimized for current conditions. When conditions change, the systems fail and populations crash. It has happened dozens of times across thousands of years. Let me tell you about what caused this climate catastrophe, because understanding the mechanism helps us appreciate both how vulnerable ancient civilizations were and what lessons we might draw for our own time. The 4.2 kiloyear event appears to have been caused by a shift in atmospheric circulation patterns. The monsoons that brought rain to South Asia and East Africa weakened. The westerly winds that brought moisture to the Mediterranean shifted northward. Why did this happen? Scientists aren't entirely certain. Some point to changes in solar output. The sun's energy fluctuates over centuries, and these fluctuations can trigger climate shifts. Others suggest ocean circulation changes that altered the distribution of heat and moisture. What we do know is that the drought was severe and prolonged. This wasn't a bad year or two. It was a fundamental shift in climate patterns that lasted for decades, possibly centuries, long enough to exhaust any reserves civilizations had built up. And the ancient civilizations had almost no ability to respond. They couldn't import food from unaffected regions. The drought was too widespread. They couldn't move their populations. Where would they go? They couldn't change their agricultural systems quickly enough to adapt. The response was what you'd expect. Social order broke down. People fled the cities. Governments lost legitimacy when they couldn't feed their populations. Warfare increased as groups competed for shrinking resources. The complex systems that had sustained civilization collapsed. Let me tell you about the human experience of this collapse. Because behind the archaeological data and the climate reconstructions are millions of people whose lives were destroyed by forces they couldn't understand or control. Imagine being a farmer in the Akkadian Empire. Your family has worked this land for generations. You know exactly when to plant, when to harvest, how much water your crops need. This knowledge has been passed down for centuries. It works. Then the rains fail. Not completely at first, just less than usual. Your harvest is smaller, but you have reserves. The next year is worse. Your reserves are depleted. The third year, there is barely enough to plant for the next season. The fourth year, there is nothing. You've done nothing wrong. You've followed the same practices that worked for your parents and grandparents. But the rules have changed, and no one told you. The world your knowledge was designed for no longer exists. What do? You could stay and hope the rains return. Many did, and many died. You could move to the cities, hoping the government would help. Many did that too, and the cities couldn't handle the influx. You could become a refugee, wandering in search of better conditions. Many did that as well. The texts from this period describe social breakdown in vivid terms. Servants abandoning their masters. Children abandoned by parents who couldn't feed them. Temples looted by desperate people who had lost faith in gods who wouldn't send rain. In Egypt, tomb inscriptions from the first intermediate period boast of local governors who managed to keep their populations alive. I gave bread to the hungry and clothing to the naked, they proclaim. These weren't humble brags. They were genuine achievements in a time when most couldn't manage even that. The ancient texts also reveal something else. The search for explanations. When catastrophe strikes, people need to know why. They need someone or something to blame. They need to believe that order can be restored if the right actions are taken. In Akkad, they blamed the last king, Naram's sin, saying he had offended the gods by sacking a temple. The drought was divine punishment, the gods' revenge. If only the king hadn't been so arrogant, the rains would have continued. In Egypt, they blamed the pharaohs for losing the favor of Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept the universe functioning properly. The failure of the Nile floods was evidence that Ma'at had been violated. Restoration required restoring proper order. These explanations were wrong. Of course, the drought had nothing to do with temples sacked or cosmic order violated. It was a natural climate event, no different in kind from the droughts that had come before, just more severe and prolonged. But the explanations served a purpose. They gave people something to do, restore proper worship, support legitimate rulers, maintain cosmic order. They offered hope that the catastrophe could be ended through right action. False hope, perhaps, but hope nonetheless. Let me tell you about what came after the collapse. Because civilizations don't just disappear, they transform. The survivors adapt, rebuild, and create new forms of social organizations suited to change conditions. In Mesopotamia, after a period of chaos, new kingdoms emerged. The third dynasty of Ur reunited much of the former Akkadian Empire about a century after the collapse. They had learned from the catastrophe. Their records show sophisticated grain storage and distribution systems. The new rulers built massive ziggurats, stepped temple platforms that still awe visitors today. They created elaborate bureaucracies to manage resources. They were determined not to be caught unprepared again. Whether they succeeded in the long run is another question. In Egypt, the Middle Kingdom eventually emerged from the chaos of the first intermediate period. The new pharaohs were different from their old kingdom predecessors, more concerned with practical administration, less focused on pyramid building, more aware of their dependence on the Nile's cooperation. Egyptian literature from after the collapse shows a changed worldview. Texts like the instructions of Merikah council rulers to be just and attentive to their people's needs. Do justice whilst you exist on earth, it advises. Calm the weeper, do not oppress the widow. The Indus Valley civilization's fate was different. It didn't recover in the same form. Instead, its population dispersed into smaller agricultural communities across a wider area. The great cities were never rebuilt. The writing system was lost. But the people didn't vanish. Genetic and cultural evidence suggests continuity between the Indus Valley population and later peoples of South Asia. The civilization ended, but its descendants carried forward elements of its culture, adapting to new conditions. Let me tell you more about how societies transformed after the collapse. Because the changes weren't just political, they were cultural, religious, and psychological. People who live through catastrophe see the world differently. Before the collapse, Mesopotamian religion emphasized the god's reliability. Proper worship would ensure proper outcomes. The temples managed enormous economic resources because people believed divine favor brought prosperity. The system worked until it didn't. After the collapse, Mesopotamian literature became darker, more questioning. Texts like the Dialogue of Pessimism questioned whether anything had meaning. The poem of the righteous sufferer asked why good people suffered. These weren't questions people asked when times were good. In Egypt, the confidence of the Old Kingdom gave way to introspection. Pre-collapse texts assumed the pharaoh's divine power guaranteed order. Post-collapse texts acknowledged that rulers could fail, that order could break down, that prosperity wasn't guaranteed. The Book of the Dead, which became central to Egyptian religion in later periods, reflects anxieties that emerged after the collapse. Its elaborate preparations for the afterlife, its detailed instructions for navigating divine judgment, suggest a culture preoccupied with security in a way it hadn't been before. Architecture changed too. Pre-collapse rulers built monuments to their own glory, the pyramids being the supreme example. Post-collapse rulers built more practical infrastructure. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs focused on irrigation systems, border fortifications, administrative centers. This shift from monument building to infrastructure building might seem like decline, but it also represents learning. The post-collapse societies understood something their predecessors hadn't, that glory means nothing if you can't feed your people. Survival comes before splendor. The social structures changed as well. The Old Kingdom had been highly centralized, with all power flowing from the pharaoh. The Middle Kingdom that emerged after the collapse was more federated, with local governors holding real power. Decentralization was a response to central failure. Similarly, the Third Dynasty of UA that reunited Mesopotamia after the Akkadian collapse created elaborate provincial systems. Local administrators had significant autonomy, but reported through standardized bureaucratic channels, control through paperwork rather than just force. These administrative innovations would shape governance for millennia. The bureaucratic state, with its records, its hierarchies, its standardized procedures, was partly a response to the chaos of collapse, order through system rather than through personality. This is important to understand. Civilizational collapse doesn't mean everyone dies. It means complex social systems break down, populations disperse or decline, and ways of life change dramatically. The people continue, but their world is transformed. Let me tell you about what the 4.2 kiloyear event reveals about the relationship between climate and civilization. Because this ancient catastrophe has lessons for our own time that we ignore at our peril. The first lesson is that climate stability is not guaranteed. We live in an unusually stable climate period, the Holocene, that has persisted for about 12,000 years. This stability made agriculture possible, and agriculture made civilization possible. But stability is not permanence. The civilizations destroyed by the 4.2 kiloyear event had no way to know their climate was about to change. They had built their societies around patterns that had been reliable for centuries. Then those patterns changed, and everything fell apart. The second lesson is that complex civilizations are particularly vulnerable to climate stress. Simple societies can adapt. Hunter-gatherers can move to follow resources. But cities with hundreds of thousands of people, supported by specialized agriculture and complex trade networks, can't move. They depend on conditions staying within certain. When those limits are exceeded, the whole system fails. Not gradually, not gracefully, but rapidly and catastrophically. The 4.2 kiloyear event didn't take millennia to bring down civilizations. It took decades. A single human lifetime saw the end of worlds. The third lesson is about political legitimacy. Ancient governments derived their authority from their ability to maintain order and ensure prosperity. When they couldn't do that, when the rains failed and the harvests died, people stopped believing in them. The pharaohs claimed to ensure the Nile's floods through their divine connection to the gods. When the floods failed anyway, that claim was exposed as hollow. The Akkadian kings claimed universal power, but they couldn't make it rain. Legitimacy based on false promises doesn't survive reality. Let me tell you about some of the specific decisions people made during the collapse. Because when systems fail, individuals must improvise, and their choices shaped what came after. Some Akkadian administrators tried to maintain order through force. They fortified their positions, hoarded grain, demanded continued tribute from populations that had nothing to give. This approach sometimes preserved local power briefly, but generated resentment that led to violent overthrow. Other administrators took a different approach. They distributed their reserves, reduced demands on the population, tried to maintain legitimacy through generosity rather than coercion. These leaders sometimes survived longer, though many were eventually overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis. Religious institutions faced impossible choices. Temples had accumulated enormous grain reserves over generations of prosperity. When famine struck, should they distribute those reserves to the starving, or preserve them to maintain temple operations and ensure continued divine favor? Different temples made different choices. Some opened their stores and won popular support. Others kept their reserves and were eventually looted by desperate mobs. The records suggest no consistent pattern, just individuals making decisions under impossible pressure. Family structures changed under the pressure. Extended families that had lived in separate households consolidated to share resources. Young people delayed marriage because they couldn't afford to establish new households. Birth rates dropped as people chose not to bring children into a dying world. Some people turned to banditry. When legitimate work couldn't feed your family, some chose illegitimate alternatives. The texts describe roving bands attacking travelers and raiding settlements. Violence became a survival strategy for those with nothing to lose. Others turned to religion with renewed fervor. If the gods had caused this catastrophe, perhaps the gods could end it. Texts describe increased offerings, more elaborate rituals, desperate attempts to restore divine favor. The temples that survived often grew more powerful through this desperation. Migration patterns shifted dramatically. Before the collapse, most people lived their entire lives within a few kilometers of where they were born. During the collapse, entire communities relocated, walking hundreds of kilometers to find habitable land. These migrations brought different peoples into contact and conflict. The Gutians, a mountain people from the east, moved into the collapsing Akkadian heartland, Whether they caused the collapse as later Mesopotamian texts claimed or merely filled the vacuum is debated, but their presence transformed the ethnic and cultural landscape. In Egypt, the migration was often internal. From the parched countryside to the slightly less desperate cities, from Upper Egypt where the Nile failure was worse to Lower Egypt, where some water still flowed. These internal refugees strained urban resources and contributed to social breakdown. The fourth lesson is about adaptation and resilience. The societies that recovered from the collapse were those that learned from it. They built grain storage facilities, they developed water management systems, they created bureaucracies to distribute resources during shortages. The societies that didn't adapt, or couldn't adapt, disappeared. The Indus Valley civilization never rebuilt its great cities. Whatever prevented them from adapting, perhaps the rivers had shifted too far. Perhaps the population was too dispersed. Meant that form of civilization was gone forever. Let me tell you about what scientists have learned about the 4.2 kiloyear event in recent decades, because our understanding keeps evolving as new evidence emerges. The event was first identified in the 1970s through studies of ancient lake sediments and peat bogs. Researchers noticed a widespread signature of dry conditions across multiple regions around the same time. Something significant had happened. In the decades since, evidence has accumulated from ice cores, cave formations, ocean sediments, and tree rings. Each source tells the same basic story: a severe, prolonged drought affecting large parts of the world, beginning around 2200 BCE. The geographical extent of the event is now fairly well established. It affected the Mediterranean region, the Near East, South Asia, East Africa, and probably parts of East Asia. Whether it reached the Americas remains uncertain. The evidence there is less clear. Let me tell you more about how scientists pieced together the evidence for this ancient catastrophe. The detective work spans multiple disciplines and multiple continents, gradually building a picture of what happened. One of the most important pieces of evidence came from a cave in China called Dongye Cave. Stalagmites there grow layer by layer, and the chemical composition of each layer records the rainfall when it formed. The Dongye stalagmites show a clear signal of drought around 4,200 years ago. Half a world away, in the Gulf of Oman, sediment cores tell a similar story. Layers deposited during the drought contain more wind-blown dust, evidence that surrounding lands had dried out and were eroding. The dust signature appears suddenly and persists for decades. Ice cores from Mount Kilimanjaro in East Africa show decreased precipitation and atmospheric changes consistent with weakened monsoons. The African climate was linked to the Asian and Mediterranean climates, all affected by the same global shift. In Israel, pollen preserved in lake sediments shows a shift from oak forests to more drought-resistant species. The landscape itself was transforming, with vegetation adapted to wetter conditions, giving way to plants that could survive with less water. Even tree rings from European oaks tell part of the story. Growth rings from around this period are notably thin, indicating stressed trees struggling with reduced moisture. The drought's fingerprint appears in wood grown 4,000 years ago. The convergence of evidence from so many different sources, using so many different methods, is what makes the 4.2 kiloyear event scientifically compelling. No single piece of evidence would be convincing alone. Together, they tell a consistent story. Archaeological evidence adds another dimension. The timing of site abandonments, the sudden changes in material culture, the appearance of fortifications where none existed before, all these correlate with the climate evidence. At Tel Leilan in Syria, an ancient Akkadian administrative center, excavations revealed a clear break. Below a certain layer, the site shows a thriving city with temples, residences, and grain storage facilities. Above that layer, nothing but wind-blown dust for 300 years. The soil at Tel Leilan contains a signature of aridity, increased levels of certain minerals that accumulate when water evaporates faster than it is replaced. The drought isn't just inferred from texts, it is written in the chemistry of the soil. The timing has been refined through improved dating techniques. The onset appears to have been around 2200 BCE, with the most severe conditions lasting perhaps 2 centuries before gradual recovery began. Long enough to destroy civilizations, long enough to transform societies. Some researchers have proposed that volcanic eruptions may have triggered or worsened the drought. Sulfate deposits in ice cores from around this time suggest significant volcanic activity. Volcanic aerosols can affect climate patterns, potentially weakening monsoons. Others point to natural variations in solar output or ocean circulation. The climate system is complex, and multiple factors probably contributed. What matters is that the result was a drought severe enough to bring down civilizations across a huge area. In 2012, the International Commission on Stratigraphy formally recognized the 4.2 kiloyear event by naming a new geological epoch. The late Holocene period, beginning 4,200 years ago, is now officially called the Megalayan Age, after a cave in India that preserves a clear record of the drought. This formal recognition reflects how significant the event was, not just for human history, but for Earth's climate history. It marks a boundary visible in geological records worldwide, a moment when conditions shifted measurably on a global scale. Let me share some thoughts about what this ancient catastrophe means for our own time. Because we face our own climate challenges, and the past has lessons to offer. We're currently changing Earth's climate faster than any natural process has in millions of years. The carbon dioxide we're adding to the atmosphere will alter rainfall patterns, shift growing seasons, and stress water supplies. Some regions will become drier, others will face floods. The ancient civilizations that fell to the 4.2 kiloyear event had no warning and no understanding. They couldn't have prepared because they didn't know what was coming. We don't have that excuse. We know climate change is happening. We know it will stress our systems. The ancient civilizations were also relatively simple compared to ours. Their supply chains were local or regional. Their populations were in the millions, not billions. Our civilization is far more complex, more powerful, but also more vulnerable to disruption. A drought like the 4.2 kiloyear event today would be catastrophic on a scale hard to imagine. Billions of people depend on monsoon rains that could weaken. Hundreds of millions live in areas that could become uninhabitable. Our connected global economy means disruption anywhere spreads everywhere, but we also have capabilities the ancient civilizations lacked. We can store and transport food across vast distances. We can desalinate seawater and pump groundwater. We can develop drought-resistant crops and efficient irrigation systems. We have tools our ancestors couldn't have imagined. The question is whether we'll use those capabilities wisely, whether we'll prepare for the changes coming or wait until crisis forces our hand, whether we'll learn from the ancient civilizations that fell or repeat their mistakes at an even larger scale. Let me tell you about some specific modern parallels that make the ancient collapse relevant today. Because the patterns that destroyed those first civilizations are visible in our own situation. Consider California's Central Valley, one of the most productive agricultural regions on Earth. It depends on irrigation, just like ancient Mesopotamia. And, like ancient Mesopotamia, it faces both water scarcity and salinization. The parallels are uncomfortable. The Ogallala Aquifer, beneath the American Great Plains, is being depleted faster than it can recharge. Farmers have pumped it for generations, enabling vast agricultural production. But the water is finite, and in some areas it is running out. What happens then? The Middle East today faces water crises that echo the ancient catastrophe. The Tigris and Euphrates, the same rivers that sustained ancient Mesopotamia, are drying up as upstream dams and climate change reduce their flow. Civilizations built on those rivers are stressed again. Lake Chad in Africa has shrunk by 90% since the 1960s. Millions of people who depended on it for water, fish, and irrigation have been displaced. Some researchers link the rise of Boko Haram to competition for shrinking resources around the lake. Syria's civil war, which began in 2011, was preceded by a devastating drought from 2006 to 2010. Rural farmers fled to cities, creating social pressures that contributed to unrest. Climate stress didn't cause the war, but it was part of the context. These modern examples show that the patterns of the 4.2 kiloyear event aren't ancient history. They're current events. Water stress leads to agricultural failure, leads to migration, leads to social tension, leads to political instability. The sequence is familiar. What makes our situation different, and potentially worse, is the scale. The ancient civilizations affected by the 4.2 kiloyear event had populations in the millions. Our global civilization has 8 billion people, most of them in cities that depend on distant food production. Our food system is a marvel of efficiency, but efficiency comes at the cost of resilience. Just-in-time delivery means cities have only a few days of food stored at any time. A major disruption to transportation, to production, to distribution could create crisis far faster than ancient droughts did, and climate change is accelerating. The shift that destroyed the first civilizations took place over decades or centuries. Current climate change is measurable over years. We're changing conditions faster than ecosystems or societies can adapt. The ancient rulers blamed their predecessors or angered gods. They looked for someone to hold responsible, some way to restore favor. We know better now. Climate change isn't punishment, it is physics. The only response is adaptation and mitigation. As you drift towards sleep tonight, think about water. The water in your glass, the water that falls from the sky, the water in rivers and reservoirs that makes your city possible. All of it part of a global system that can shift in ways that transform human life. Let me share a few more thoughts about what the ancient collapse can teach us about preparation and resilience. Because the civilizations that recovered did certain things right, and those lessons still apply. The societies that recovered best had maintained some diversity in their food systems. They hadn't abandoned all their traditional crops for the most productive irrigated varieties. When the irrigation failed, they could fall back on drought-resistant alternatives. They also had social networks that extended beyond immediate family and local community, trade connections, marriage alliances, religious networks. These ties meant that when one area failed, help might come from another. Isolation was death, connection was survival. The surviving communities also maintained institutional knowledge. They kept records of previous crises and how they were handled. They preserved techniques for water conservation and food preservation. Memory was a tool for survival. Perhaps most importantly, the societies that recovered were willing to change. They abandoned practices that no longer worked. They moved when staying meant death. They accepted new arrangements, new leaders, new territories, new ways of life. When the old ones became untenable, the societies that couldn't change, that clung to old ways, old territories, old leaders, even as conditions transformed, those are the ones that vanished completely. Flexibility wasn't optional, it was existential. There is one more lesson worth considering. The 4.2 kiloyear event affected everyone, but it affected some more than others. The wealthy and powerful could buy food when prices rose. They could move to better land. They could hire guards against bandits. The poor and powerless had no such options. They were the first to starve, the first to flee, the first to die. The collapse wasn't democratic. It fell hardest on those least able to protect themselves. This too is a pattern that repeats. Climate change today follows the same pattern. Those who contributed least to causing it will suffer most from its effects. The wealthy nations that industrialized early can afford adaptation. The poor nations that barely emit greenhouse gases cannot. The people who lived through the 4.2 kiloyear event didn't choose their fate. The rains stopped falling and their worlds ended. They did what they could to survive. Some succeeded, many didn't. Their experience is a warning encoded in clay tablets and ruined cities. We read that warning now across 4,000 years. Will we heed it? Will we build the resilience our ancestors lacked? Will we make choices they couldn't make because they didn't understand what was happening to them? The answer is up to us. The civilizations that fell to the drought were real achievements. The Akkadian Empire united peoples who had never been united before. Old Kingdom Egypt built monuments that still inspire wonder. The Indus Valley created urban life of remarkable sophistication. These weren't failed experiments. They were triumphs. Triumphs that climate destroyed. The people who built them were as intelligent, as capable, as ambitious as anyone alive today. They just lived in a time when climate could change faster than societies could adapt. And we might live in such a time too. The climate changes we're setting in motion will unfold over centuries. Our grandchildren and their grandchildren will deal with consequences we create. What world will they inherit? What choices will they have? The ancient civilizations thought they were building for eternity. The pyramids were supposed to last forever. And they have, though the civilization that built them fell. The ziggurats of Ur were meant to connect earth and heaven permanently. Now they're archaeological sites. Our own monuments, our cities, our systems, our achievements seem permanent to us. But the 4.2 kiloyear event reminds us that nothing built on unstable foundations truly lasts. Climate is the foundation. When it shifts, everything built on it can fall. That is not meant to be despairing. It is meant to be clarifying. Understanding our vulnerability is the first step to reducing it. Knowing what happened to the ancient civilizations helps us avoid their fate. Their collapse can be our lesson, not our destiny. Think about the last pharaoh of the Old Kingdom, watching the Nile fail year after year, unable to understand why the gods had turned against him. Think about the Akkadian farmer watching his fields turn to dust, doing everything right, but getting only failure. They couldn't have known what was happening to them. The science didn't exist. The records didn't exist. They faced cosmic injustice without explanation, natural catastrophe without understanding. Their suffering was compounded by mystery. We're different. We know. We have the data, the models, the understanding. If we face catastrophe, it won't be because we didn't know better. It will be because we knew better and didn't act. That is a different kind of tragedy, one we can still prevent. If you are drifting off now, let these thoughts settle gently. The ancient civilizations rose and fell. New ones emerged from their ruins. The cycle of growth and collapse has repeated many times and will repeat again. But each cycle teaches us something. The 4,000-year-old warning still echoes. The tablets still speak of failed harvests and wandering refugees. The ruins still stand where great cities once thrived. The evidence surrounds us for anyone willing to see. Thanks for spending this time with me tonight, thinking about ancient catastrophes and their modern lessons. There are more mysteries to explore on this channel, more stories from the deep past that illuminate our present. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you next time. Good night. Sleep well, and when you wake, maybe give some thought to water, where it comes from, how certain it is, and what would happen if it stopped. The ancients learned the hard way. We have a chance to learn more gently.